needless to say, I hope thank you all for coming. And we were talking. May I call you Aidan?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I was brought up like Mr. Levy. Yeah, I don't want. If the lights fell, my parents would have been upset. But Aidan and I were talking before we arrived, and I was saying that I come from. Well, some of you know I write poetry a little bit, but I come from ministers, Baptist ministers. This is not to impugn anyone else who may also have been brought up, but we all kind of go like this, like LP length, and I promise not to over orate, but we really are in for what I think will be a wonderful conversation. And what my goal is, it's like a great athlete once said, I play best when I get out of my own way. So I'm going to offer questions, we'll trade fours to use some musical metaphors. And, of course, most importantly, leave time for you all to ask questions and that sort of thing. I will also say, though, thinking about length and my upbringing and all, sometimes you can read, say, a book that's 150, 200 pages long, and it feels like you've been on it like 6 weeks, a month, 10 months. This book, it's, I think the best biographies have, quote, facts, as Jack Webb used to say on Dragnet, but the soul of the artist whose work celebrated in this book is present. So I humbly implore you to, as we used to say in the 70s, check it out. Really, this is a needed piece of literature, and it's, well, like Quincy Jones said about jazz, it's soul and science. So before we start, once again, please a round of applause for Aidan Levy for doing this wonderful thing.
Thank you all for coming. And I also want to humbly implore everybody here, if you don't already have it, to get Reuben Jackson's book, Scattered Clouds. This is my copy that I brought with me, and you better sign it before we leave tonight.
Blushing while black. Okay. Well, again, thank you all. When I was preparing these questions a while back, oddly enough, the Sound of Music was on TV. And you know that there's that song that started at the very beginning, a very good place to start, blah, blah, blah. And I thought what we could do, if you don't mind, is to, before we get into Mr. Rollins' life, but just talk about how you intersected with music, and specifically your relationship with the tenor saxophone, which I'm sure many of you know is Sonny Rollins' instrument of choice, if you don't mind.
Well, I wanted to play the saxophone starting when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my parents would take us on a vacation to Florida every February, and I grew up in the Hartford, Connecticut area, and I look forward to these trips because we'd get to see my grandparents and some family friends. But the thing I was really looking forward to when I was about 5 was to go to this restaurant called Crab Pot's Old House, and they had a band with a saxophone player, and mostly they did Jimmy Buffett covers. But I was 5, so I don't know if there are any parrot heads here, but it was about age appropriate for me, and I would always request that they play Cheeseburger in Paradise, which was my favorite song for about a year, because, well, I started to hear jazz on the radio. That would always be on in the car, and when I was 9, my parents finally relented and got me a saxophone. I started on alto, and the first jazz album that I ever bought with my own money was Saxophone Colossus. I was telling Reuben earlier tonight that the first album I ever bought with my own money was actually Rage Against the Machine, Evil Empire. But that's another story, though. Because I, as soon as I heard that album, I don't know, it was just kind of a revolution in my mind, and I then moved to tenor, and essentially what happened is I was a little bit bigger than another saxophone player in the band, so I kept having to play the bigger horn. I moved to tenor, then I moved to baritone. But Sonny Rollins' music was always there, and you know, I just even just hearing St. Thomas, or You Don't Know What Love Is, that was really the entry point, was You Don't Know What Love Is on that album. And I kept just trying to play like Sonny, but of course nobody can play like Sonny, and I definitely never would be able to. But about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Sonny when I was doing some writing for Blue Note Records, and just to get to talk to him for an hour or two was so inspiring that I wanted to know even more than I already did. So I read all the books on Sonny and listened to as much as I could, and I still wanted to know more. So at some point I had the crazy idea, maybe I'll just write that book myself. And it wasn't something I thought I would ever actually do, but a couple people persuaded me that maybe it could be possible. And I did a fellowship at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York at CUNY, which at the time was being directed by Gary Giddens, who is a great champion of Sonny Rollins' work. And about 7 years later, here we are with this book. That was a kind of circuitous answer to your question.
Not really, no. One of the things I was going to ask you, you know, so go from Julie Andrews, and see, I got Julie Andrews in this one. So we got Rage Against the Machine, Julie Andrews, you know, Jimmy Buffett.
You have a great line. It goes something like, "The hills are alive," with the sound of boiling grits.
That's true. That's true. What I was thinking though was that there's a line from the poet Amiri Baraka. Well, it was an essay called "Hunting is not just those heads on the wall." And if you could just talk more about, so you delve into this, you're smitten, as my mother would say, with the sound and the instrument. But just kind of you start writing this book, and what do you learn? I mean, I know that there are facts one learns, but talk just about the journey. You know, think of it like it's like your 32-bar song of this person. Just, you know, talk about some of that if you could.
Well, it's been a long journey, and I suppose it could have been longer, but I was so struck by Sonny Rollins' spirituality when I first came into contact with him, because growing up, I mean, I could feel that right away. You know, on that intro to You Don't Know What Love Is. But I think I associated Sonny with this towering virtuosity. And if you listen to songs like Be Swift or Be Quick, which are maybe not the best known Sonny Rollins songs, but if you pick up an album called Tour de Force, you can hear it. It's about the fastest anybody's ever played, I think. You I mean, anybody would think of Sonny as kind of, the heavyweight champion of the world when you hear that. But the thing I discovered with him is that the spiritual side and that virtuosity are not mutually exclusive. That they can coexist. And most of what I've spoken about with him falls more on the spiritual side of life, for lack of a better word. But the journey here, which I guess has had a spiritual dimension, has also involved a lot of archival research. And before I started the book, I knew that Sonny's collection would become available at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, which is only a couple blocks from where Sonny was born on 137th Street. But I didn't know what might be in there. And I'd heard differing reports from people. I'd been doing research at the Max Roach collection at the Library of Congress here. So I'd logged quite a bit of time going through that. If anybody's seen it here, I mean, it's staggering. Max Roach kept everything, told receipts. If the Clifford Brown Max Roach Quintet bought new sport jackets, there would be a record of that. And I didn't know if that would be the case for Sonny Rollins. I'd heard it's not that much, and that's all I'd heard. And then when I finally got into that library, my wife was about 4 or 5 months pregnant with our first child, and I thought, I'm never going to be able to see everything in this collection before this baby comes. Because it was, I mean, it's just thousands and thousands of pages of documents, business records, correspondence, journal entries. And I did end up going through everything. So a lot of the book was based on that, and just trying to decipher what was in that archive. Another big part of it was a collection of recordings from a collector named Carl Smith in Portland, Maine. And he, in about the year 2000, discovered Sonny's later work, and he felt like he had discovered an unknown island. And he decided to commit himself to amassing what became really the world's largest collection of Sonny Rollins live tapes, going back to about 1950. And I was able to visit Carl in Maine and listen to some of that material that he'd called in his home studio. But then, right before I left, he actually said, I'd like to give you the collection while you work on the book. So that was a gift and really changed what this book would be. In addition to that, there were other archival sources. Sonny was a prolific letter writer, and for one example, when he was on his bridge sabbatical and not performing in 1961, he got a letter from a college student who was working on a term paper, asking Sonny some questions, and I think about the state of jazz. And I don't think he expected a response, but Sonny wrote, it's about a 6 or 7 page handwritten letter. And the student's name is Marty Burns, and he's actually sitting right here. And thank goodness he saved that letter, because Rusty Hassan actually has the original. And it's just an amazing document. And Sonny sent his letter off thinking maybe it would be a part of the term paper and that would be that. but he had this generosity of spirit, and he was a real searcher. So he was politically involved and spiritually involved, and that letter felt like listening to a Sonny Rollins solo. So that was a big part of the journey. Then there are, of course, tens of thousands of articles that were written over the years. So I was able to I found those are mostly accessible, just on different periodicals databases. For instance, there's a review that you wrote of a Sonny Rollins album that's actually cited in the book from, I think the late 70s.
I had hair then, I think.
It might be Easy Living. I can't remember
I
much.
don't know.
Yeah.
That sounds right, yeah. Wow, yeah.
Where were you? Do you remember where you were writing for then?
Late 70s. Probably the Unicorn Times, which was a monthly arts newspaper here.
I think that's it. I think
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Oh my gosh. You know, you're getting old and you become archival. But no, that's a real, no, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to cut you off.
Please do.
One of the things I wanted to also say about the book is that not unlike Sonny Rollins' musical contributions, but for me, each chapter is like a chorus, in a performance or recording. And I marvel at the way, there is development, and yet it's a kind of recapitulation, which we talked about at dinner tonight. And if you're familiar with Mr. Rollins' work, you might hear a standard like, say, there's no business like show business. And again, I won't sing because I care for your ears, but you hear the theme, and then of course there's development of that. But he'll come back, and it could be a motif, but enough to remind you what you're listening to, what the piece is, if you're unfamiliar with it. Which, see, for me again, is where my Baptist family comes in. But anyway, I think the way you developed your thesis reminds me a lot of music in the best way. And I wanted to make that comment. What I also wanted to ask you about too, though, was, see, in referring to his spirituality, and maybe this is not true for you, but you all out here, but we sometimes consciously or subconsciously have ready-mades or assumptions about musicians who are considered jazz musicians. And it's not, what's that old song? It ain't necessarily so. And so much of what you have documented goes in the other direction. I mean, I think the spirituality you refer to is there. He's also, and maybe you had this, very self-effacing and down to earth. So it's not the person who has been to the top of some mountain and goes, well, I'm enlightened and you're not. How do you, but talk a bit about his upbringing, and that's another thing you'll find in the book, is that it's not, there are the facts, but there are, like if you look at a great score and you see like the third trumpet's doing this, you didn't know this, you didn't know this, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are these themes that he always returned to, and it does go all the way back for him. And he would never entirely lose sight of the tune he was playing. For example, he wrote a composition called Olio, which was recorded with Miles Davis in 1954, and that's rhythm changes, meaning it's based on the George Gershwin I Got Rhythm, one of the more familiar harmonic progressions. And you have the Miles Davis version, in which at some various moments the piano drops out and the band is just strolling as they thought of it. And Sonny then went on to pioneer playing in a pianoless trio, but he would never lose sight of the tune. And when he recorded it again in the early 60s on an album called Our Man in Jazz, which many people think of as being very much in an Ornette Coleman vein, he recorded Olio again in a very different setting. But even in that context, when he's with Don Cherry and Billy Higgins, who had collaborated with Ornette Coleman, and the bassist Bob Cranshaw, he still doesn't lose sight of the tune. He keeps coming back to it over the full version. I think it was more than 20 minutes. It may have been cut down a little bit by the producer George Avakian so it could fit on an LP. But he keeps returning to that theme and to that progression. You can still hear it if you're listening closely. In that same version of the tune, at some point, he also seems to start playing a slow blues right in the middle of it, and kind of superimpose the blues onto that harmonic structure, and then come back to Olio again. I think that's part of his concept of a groove, of groove-based music, of returning back to that theme, of bringing it back home again. And I think Sonny became associated with this idea of thematic improvisation, and the idea is that he develops an improvised solo kind of like a sonata form, that there's kind of development there. But the more I've thought about it, because I think it's an apt concept, because he does keep returning when you listen to Sonny Rollins' music, it's not necessarily developing in this kind of onward and upward structure. Like this, the more I think about it, that model seems predicated on a concept of growth, which is sort of part of a more capitalist framework, like a teleological. We're all, it's a constant ascension. We're always upward, more and more and more. But when you listen to Sonny Rollins, he comes back to the same theme again. There's a repetition of it. It's not, let's always add to it.
Right.
That's part of groove-based music. You mentioned Amiri Baraka, and I think of the idea of the changing same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Sonny is a part of that tradition. I mean, there's a continuum there. But in terms of the oratorical quality of his music, because you were bringing up the idea that there's something similar between your Baptist preacher relatives and what you heard in jazz musicians. I mean, I think that that's very present for Sonny Rollins, and not just in an abstract way, because he grew up in Harlem, going to the Moravian church, and he had this background in growing up in a West Indian family. His grandfather was a singer, and he inherited that tradition. His mother used to take him to calypso dances in Harlem at places like the Renaissance Ballroom or the Park Palace, and he would hear calypsonians like Macbeth the Great or maybe like Lord Invader, these different artists. But he was always going to these church services, and the Moravian church, as I understand it, was stuffy, and I think his sister sang in the choir, but Sonny wasn't that involved in that. But his grandmother, who was a follower of Marcus Garvey, took Sonny to Mother Horn's church in Harlem, which is kind of like a sanctified church, and that was some of his first exposure to live music. So he absorbed that, and some of that's the spiritual center in his music, I think, comes from that experience. And then going forward, you think about the connection between that sacred music and what Sonny was doing. He also spent time with a gospel family in Chicago that took him in, and it's the Gay family, and they're the family's still active in Chicago, and Donald Gay is somebody I interviewed for the book. He's a preacher in Chicago, and the matriarch of that family, Fanny Gay, was big in the Church of God in Christ. And Sonny used to go to church there and take some of that in. And he fell in love with one of the daughters, who was thought of as the Errol Garner of gospel. So that was there. And, you know, even when Sonny was in Rikers, the church came out as a kind of beacon, but through the music. This isn't to say, oh, Sonny is a good Christian. That's not the point of what I'm saying. This is just something about the music there and being part of that tradition. So, you know, when he was in Rikers, he got support from the chaplain there, who was named Armin Georgiorian. And what Pastor Georgiorian did was he took all the musicians and got them an assignment arranging the hymns for services. So I did this. I remember doing this one interview with Sonny, and he started singing "Jesu, Joy of Man's Desire." He said I was just imagine Sonny Rollins playing that, because he said he'll never forget that melody from playing it at that time. But you know, the importance of melody is something that's always there. I mean, I think it goes back to those early experiences at places like Mother Horns. Just coming back to that theme, never losing sight of it. That he could go out into the stratosphere, but he would always kind of come back to earth.
Yeah, I was also thinking about something John Coltrane said to the journalist scholar Frank Kopsky in 1966 about his work with Impulse, and he said that Impulse was looking for a diversified sort of catalog. So thinking about some of the things you just referred to, and if you know, and I know a lot of you are familiar with the music, but work with, you know, he worked with Coleman Hawkins, and then he's with Don Cherry and these people, and I'm thinking, you know, for me it was always like the diversity, yes, but his work is like the unanswered question in some ways, like, you know, to use Charles Ives' expression, because you hear it and it refers to, you know, you touch upon certain pieces, like the record with Coleman Hawkins. I will just quickly say, I think my father holds the Guinness Book of World Records for playing that, even posthumously. He'd play an album over and over, and you hear this and you think, wait, is this the same Sonny Rollins that we heard on, well, like it's like Our Man in Jazz, or maybe the Bridge, or any of that sort of thing, which, and I'll tie this into the statement, thinking about his relationship with the critics, and you know, I think you get this great praise for recordings like, and I know I'm jumping around chronologically, like Blue 7, but then as time goes on, you know, the critics like, what is he doing? You know, and so this tension in a sense between, I think, genuine and successful curiosity versus, or in addition to, people who wanted to be this, you know, like in aisle 7, we keep cookies, in aisle 8, we have lettuce. And, you know, you and I were talking beforehand about, well, like my love for film music, and Sonny, as again, I'm sure some of you have recorded, there's a song called by Friedrich Hollander,
Illusions.
Illusions, you know, Marlene Dietrich. And I'm listening to this, I'm crying like, I don't know, you know, I'm thinking, he gets this. It's like this broad, beautiful curiosity, and how that, I think, obviously illuminates his body of work, but then you bump up against people going, wait, what is he doing? So, and I think your book is really successful in documenting, you know, both of those things. And so if you can, you know, talk a bit about that for us, please.
Well, it's interesting that your father liked the Sonny Meets Hawk album.
No, yeah.
Because I love that album, but it's somewhat polarizing. And I think Sonny was trying to play a little bit more out on that album to differentiate himself from Coleman Hawkins, who was his hero, and there was this anxiety going into that. But as far out as he could go, he always sounded like Sonny Rollins. There was always something identifiable in his sound and his approach. Even though his approach was so eclectic, you could always hear Sonny, you know, in one note really, and it came through in the sound. But once again, there are these recurrent themes for him, and one of them would be the love of the Great American Songbook. And he became known as one of the greatest interpreters of the Great American Songbook. And many people thought that he was deliberately selecting unusual repertoire just to be kind of bizarre, let's say, or sometimes to poke fun at the piece, but that wasn't the case at all. He really loved all this music, whether it was a Friedrich Hollander composition and you know, watching Marlene Dietrich, or you know, when he did an album called Way Out West, which many people here will know, it was settings of westerns, and you know, he did I'm an Old Cowhand, and I think many people heard that and thought, God, Sonny is just making these corny tunes sound so hip. And I mean, he does, but the truth is that he loved that music, and he grew up going to westerns. And you asked about his upbringing, it all kind of manifests throughout his career. So when you look at the cover to Way Out West, you can see the influence of Herb Jeffries, the black western star. Some people thought of as the Bronze Buckaroo.
Bronze Buckaroo, yeah.
So it wasn't just a matter of kind of like signifying on this corny tradition of Americana. I think it was really saying, like, you know, Sonny's a part of that tradition, and not just a part of that tradition. I think that he was always kind of showing a way forward. I mean, he was, I think, in some ways improving on some of that material. Even if, you know, he loved the original, I think he would bring out elements in it that maybe we didn't hear before. Because I remember when I first talked to Sonny, I was thinking, man, it's just, you really show everybody like how corny all this stuff is. You know, he said, no, I love this stuff.
Beautiful, yeah.
But then after listening to Sonny, when I went back and listened to the original, it always brings out some new quality in it and gives me a greater appreciation of the source material.
Yeah.
So that was always, you know, his love of the Great American Songbook is something that always kind of came through.
Yeah. I think the sincerity is always present in that work, and this is, well, again, this was kind of pre-program conversation, but if you grew up romantic, guilty, and you hear these records in like my parents' basement, it's like pieces like Long Ago and Far Away. I mean, I know a lot of you are familiar with these pieces. Love Letters from that Jennifer Jones, Joseph Cotton film, Hand Over My Musical Heart. But the conviction, but I'll just jokingly say, because this is not my book and will continue, but he probably did more for me than a lot of therapists, because, you know, you're in love with this stuff and you think, is it okay? And back to what you were saying, though, I think, to put Ezra Pound in the conversation, his commitment to making it new. You know, the first time I heard, say, Love Letters, and I thought, whoa, like, you know a song, but then what else can you do with it? You know, and whether it's a standard or what can you do with, you know, a standard form like the blues, like say Sunny Moon for two. It's what, well, like what John Coltrane said about someone. He said, you know, it's the way you scramble the eggs. Not to, you know, offend any vegans here, but I think that commitment, and I think it comes through whether it's, you know, you're describing the music and the aforementioned spirituality, um, and it's a fascinating constant. But I don't know if you feel this way, but it's never like this is the end. This is the answer. There's always like more, you know, within. Well, whether it's a new recording or a new way of looking at pieces we quote thought we knew.
Yeah, I mean, that make it new could be almost like a mantra for the music of Sonny Rollins. Or he thought of it as the search for the lost chord, which referred to a Jimmy Durante tune that's a comic song, but which Sonny took seriously. And he really never played the same song the same way twice. Sometimes there would be maybe references back to previous work, but it would never be quite the same. And he was so rhythmically inventive in his improvisation and his approach to melody that you know, he'll just put kind of a different spin on like one of these tunes from the Great American Songbook. Even something like Winter Wonderland, you can hear him play that on that same album that you're referencing, the standard Sonny Rollins, where he does love letters and travel in the light and all these interpretations of standards. And it's a great album. Apparently it was one of his favorites of that era. But yeah, I mean, he was always looking forward. When I first spoke to him, he said, you know, I'm not what you might think of as a finished musician. And I think he meant that in two ways. Firstly, that he wasn't polished, because he was always his own worst critic and very self-deprecating. And I think he felt that his relative lack of formal training was this kind of albatross around his neck, even though, I mean, in terms of technique, no one can touch Sonny Rollins. I think he always carried that with him. So he felt like, I'm not finished in that way. But also that he's not finished, like he's not done. You know, there's always another chorus there to play. So I think it really killed him when he had to put down the horn about 10 years ago. But yeah, when he talked about that idea of being a finished musician, he expressed it as, you know, I don't have the luxury of being that way. I can't do that. And I thought, I guess that's how Sonny Rollins would frame it, because, you know, the rest of us, I think, are so lucky that he was never finished. He was saying, you know, I can't go out there and just play it the same way I did last night. I can't just do the greatest hits the way everybody wants them. He had to, but see, the way I see it, it's just much more interesting that way. I don't need to hear him play Sunny Moon for Two the exact way he played it on a night at the Village Vanguard. I can just put the record on. When he played it again, he did it differently.
I was going to get into, and I'm leaving obviously space for questions from you all, so I'm jumping around chronologically, needless to say, but as he ages, and you know, you document this again so well, my first thought too was watching great athletes, you know, how you adjust to you know, physical aging, and of course we take for granted the fact that music is, you know, it's a physiological act, and so there is a demand on one's body even when one is a virtuoso. But seeing the intersection of course, aging, mortality, when his wife Lucille dies, and for me, it was like how that too is part of a composition. How does one age? How does one grieve, integrate this into one's life? And then, as you mentioned, of course, his health says, well, it's time to stop playing, which is, I think, is as informative as these records that we're alluding to in this conversation. And it is as, for my money, it is as moving as any of the pieces we've briefly touched upon.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. But I do think that he really exemplifies the resilience. And as he has gotten older, he just kept going out there, and did it with honesty and integrity. And, part of that is the fact that he was always changing. I don't think he wanted to try to live in the past. That's something he talks about with Miles Davis too, that neither of them could ever be, would ever present their music like a museum piece, but that they were constitutionally incapable of it. But that would be a part of the aging process, or just a part of jazz as a reflection of life. That, at one point in the book, there's a quote where he says something like, jazz is like the sky, it's never the same twice. So I think that accepting that constant change is part of his music, and something that's always reflected in his music when you listen to it. I don't know, was that kind of your experience of reading the story?
Well, I see it as, forgive the metaphor, it's a little corny, but it's, the composition. And it's probably personal because, as one gets older and the landscape changes, but how I was, and those of you who will buy the book tonight will find this out, the resilience you refer to as he ages. But, again, hunting is not just those heads on the wall, to quote Mary Barak, and how there is the music itself, but then, of course, well, like he said, jazz is like the sky, things are changing, and what can we learn from, in this case, our artist? We know the work itself. Here's someone who is not, as we say here, he was not scared. He's not scared to delve into whether it was, show tunes, or like I was saying earlier tonight, my father listened to these records. The thing that grabbed me was a record he did called The Cutting Edge in 1974. Beautiful version of Edward McDowell's To a Wild Rose. And I just, if I had it would put like one box of Kleenex on this side. You put one box of Kleenex on this side. You think, how did he do this? Plus, there were, quote, what people might call a couple of funk tunes on there, but it's, I guess my point is, it's the commitment to what is in front, and it's not, like you said, it's not superfluous, nostalgic views of, say, American popular songs, or whatever it happens to be, but, how does one continue to ask the questions, and, or it's like Roca said, you live the questions like unlocked doors, or locked doors. So that's, and I'm still, sifting through that, but I thank you, because again, not to impugn other biographies, but the facts are important. But I think, the essence of a life is so, I think, often lacking in the documentation of these musicians.
Well, thank you for that, because I would not lay claim to capturing the essence of a life here. I don't think it's something that can't be done in a biography, but I was hoping in this book that if you read it, that you might be able to at least come to your own conclusions about it and get a sense of who he was and who he is. because he is still with us. But yeah, of course there are also a lot of facts in the book. But I wanted it to kind of not just be an extended CV for
Right,
Sonny Rollins.
Right, yeah,
That you're reading just an 800-page resume for the,
of course.
yeah, and I mean, a lot of that did come from having access to his archive, and he was such a prolific writer and journaler that he really did record what he was thinking about through a lot of his career. Also, just being able to talk to Sonny and get his take on things and his response to things and what he was thinking about, the bigger picture.
That's it. Yeah, it's a big picture. I think, could we throw it open to,
You alluded to Sonny's spirituality, and what I find interested in his music, in terms of his improvising, how he will fragment the melody and integrate it into his improvisations, and to the extent that it seems to be metaphysical, in terms of maybe these energies are flowing through him, and he's no more than a vehicle for the expression. Did he speak much about that? Because I know he was a highly evolved spiritual person, because he even would speak of, while performing, he could project himself outside of himself, and in the process, see himself performing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, he did talk about having these out-of-body experiences sometimes, and he was involved with the Rosicrucians for a while, but in terms of the metaphysical quality of his music, I think of it as, in part, a search for a kind of flow state. So there's a thinker named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi who kind of writes about the idea of a flow state, and many people think that artists reach this flow state in their work, and Sonny was always striving for that. He still is, to be in a place where it's just what's right in front of him. As Reuben was saying, he did an interview some years ago where he said, you can't think and play at the same time. And I think some people took that to mean that he's not thinking at all when he's playing. And I mean, I don't think that's exactly the case. But I think what he's referring to is being in this kind of flow state. You might think of it as a state of rapture. So he could only get there, though, by practicing more than I think anybody has ever practiced. There's not going to be any Guinness Book of World Records for Sonny Rollins' most practice of anybody, but I mean, I think it would be him. So there's, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of practice. They say something like, if you need to practice 10,000 hours to master any skill. So, let's multiply that by, something significant, and I think you'd get to Sonny Rollins. But there's also an element of a spiritual practice in what he's doing there, or a devotional practice. And Sonny practices a kind of religious syncretism So he's drawing from different spiritual traditions and the best of everything. And he talks a lot about the golden rule as a distillation of the best of everything that all the religions have to offer. But when he was in India, he was at an ashram run by a Swami named Chinmayananda, and he had an opportunity to meet with him. And they were working on meditation and, in a sense, trying to get to that flow state. He also saw Bismillah Khan perform, and I think he recognized something of that in his performance as well. But what the Swami said to Sonny was, when you're practicing, when you're playing the saxophone, that's a kind of meditation. So, I think it's absolutely connected for him, performing and his spirituality. Whether he considers his music to be spiritual music, I don't think that's exactly the case, but there's definitely a spirituality behind it. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I know you said you had like countless conversations, interviews with Sonny Rollins, but I wanted to know, like, what is one thing that kind of stuck out to you, like life lessons that you learned from him that kind of stick with you till now, even when it came to writing the book, as far as like whether it's a story or life lesson that you just kind of think back and be like, now I get it.
The first thing that pops in my head is just to continue with what I was just saying, the importance of practice. That if Sonny Rollins in the 2010s was still working on the fundamentals of music and showing up every day and playing scales or playing long tones and arriving hours early to a gig so that he could get a little bit more practice time in and then staying afterwards when the concert's over to keep practicing. If somebody as great as Sonny Rollins is doing that, then no one else has any excuse. However, at the same time, I think there has to be balance too. So that's something that I also took from him. That in the trajectory of his career, when he turns about 40, he starts to slow down a little bit in terms of his pace. That doesn't mean he stops moving forward. He always maintains momentum, but he gives himself time to think and reflect and to go deeper in his practice, both musically and also spiritually. So that's a lesson that I take from his work. Sonny Rollins, I think I said this already, but he's his own worst critic. No performance was ever good enough. I think he was hoping that the critics would like what he played, but even if they didn't, they would never get as harsh as he was. And I found these notes on some of his records that he made where he would record his response to different takes and he would say no, 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 and much worse than that. But he didn't pull any punches when it came to his own work. So I think there is this sense of, it's important to practice, but also, I don't know, I guess I hope that Sonny feels proud of his achievement. I think he does. I hope that when he reflects on it, that he doesn't still just say, I never made it, I never found the lost chord. But I do think that the importance of practice is a deep lesson that I took from this book. That he worked so hard at what he was doing, to not expect it to come easily. He never expected anything to come easily, and nothing ever did. And then the other one is just his belief in the golden rule and actually trying to live by that, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So he talks a lot about that, but I think the more I worked on this book, the more I started thinking about it in every situation. Not that I wasn't considering that before, but just to keep that in my head, because I think it's very easy to drift into selfishness, and you know, I have very young children, so I think about that a lot, because the golden rule is not something that a 4-year-old really follows easily. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, so that's another lesson. I mean, there are many more that come in throughout the book. But yeah, those are two big ones.
Testing 1, 2. Good evening, everyone. My name is Munir Nasser. I published a book which is referenced in yours, Upright Bass, The Musical Life and Legacy of Jamil Nasser. I want you to address the jazz book publishing industry, because to me, every jazz book is rare. There's so few of them that are coming out. You with Hachette, that's a major publisher. How did you convince them that this book would be profitable, that people would actually buy a book on Sonny Rollins? Because the conventional wisdom is that most major publishers have said they cannot sell a jazz book. That's why you don't see many of the major publishers publishing jazz books. For instance, the Miles Davis book, guess how many copies they have for the whole DC library?
How many?
One. One book in DC. I went to Foyles in London, where they say the Ray's music shop, the old Ray's I used to went to 30 years ago, is supposed to be housed in there. Dismal collection on jazz. I mean, a small little 4 or 5 books on Elton John, David Bowie. No, I'm serious. This is the biggest store. Your book wasn't in there. Nor was Herbie's. None of the major jazz books are in there. This is in London, which is supposed to be a hotbed for jazz. I checked the libraries, no jazz books. The public libraries, the British Library. And so I'm just wondering what the forecast is, because look at Freddie Hubbard. This cat's been dead since 2008, a genius virtuoso trumpet player. There's not a faint rumbling about a book on him. So I wanted to know, like, in terms of the editing, you have 700 pages. Did you get any resistance? Did they insist on a lot of control? Did you choose the cover? Did they expunge some of the content you wanted in? Just a profile of the business and the process in terms of publishing. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a great book, by the way, and it is referenced in this book, but I encourage you all to seek that book out. And, you know, Jamil Nasser, one of the greats, and he performed with Sonny as well. When were you at Ray's?
That was 1993, 1995.
Oh, okay. I
They
thought.
moved it from the, you know, where.
Yeah. No, I was thinking maybe it was more recently, because Grace hasn't responded to my email seeing if they want to do an event there.
Because they moved it into the Foyles bookstore.
So, I mean, what am I going to say here? I don't know how I convinced the publisher to do this book. That's the shortest answer I can give. And how I convinced them it would be profitable, I'm not sure to what extent I convinced them of that. I did make a case that there is interest in this music and in the history of this music, and that I think there's a global audience for it. And although they're not all English speaking, many people will seek out a book in English on Sonny Rollins. But you're right, there should be a book on Freddie Hubbard. You know, there shouldn't only be biographies of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and a very short list of others.
But do you think those sell? That's why they keep doing this different variations of the same book on Billie Holiday and then
Yes,
the
yes.
contemporary jazz period, because they died in 59 and 70 and 60.
And I mean, I think that's why you've seen most of the jazz books that come out either being published independently or through academic publishers, because the trade publishing world is a business, and they're very committed to their profit margin, and they have to submit their P&Ls and all that, and they're looking for sales to be rapid over the first year or the first month. And with a jazz book, it's going to be a slow burn, and they're not thinking about lifetime sales. So they're not thinking, maybe over 10 years we'll get our money back, because a lot of those people are thinking, well, I might be dead by then. So like I said, a lot of it has gone into the world of academia, which is the case with jazz in general. And we could have a whole panel discussion on that, on the institutionalization of jazz, in terms of how the market share of jazz affects the availability of material or the sales figures that we get. I mean, let me just take this back to Sonny Rollins, because there's an element of that being a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, Sonny has spoken about this on many occasions, that people aren't being taught about jazz. They're not seeing it on TV. It's not a part of pop culture, in part because the people making the decisions are cowards. And they don't want to get fired if they take a big risk and it doesn't pay off. So, in a way, I'm hoping that this book sells enough copies that there could be another jazz book. Not for selfish reasons. I'm not that concerned with that. But I don't want this book to become an argument for why nobody will ever publish a jazz book again.
Thank you.
How you doing? I wanted to know if when you talk to Sonny, did he share the environment in which he grew up? He grew up in a segregated environment, how that impacted him as a musician, because in that time, train could live around the corner, Sonny Stick could live down the street. And so I wanted to know, did he express how segregation impacted his music and jazz in general? And how does he see it, I guess, post-segregation? And if that spreading the music out and I wish I could go around the corner and see Sonny Rollins, as a musician. And so, I don't know, did he talk to you about that thing?
Yeah, and I don't even know if he would think of it as pre and post, because, I mean, if you look at our society, it's still deeply segregated. And if you think about what happened at the State of the Union last night, I mean, but let me try to answer your question here. I mean, he's still thinking about social justice in music, and he's always thought about that. And growing up, I think I mentioned that his grandmother, Miriam, was a follower of Marcus Garvey, and instilled in him the importance of the civil rights struggle, and being, a part of the resistance from when he was 4 years old. And he would go on these marches in support of Paul Robeson or the Scottsboro Boys on Lenox Avenue, and his grandmother hung a Black Nationals flag in the house, and this became a part of his music. So his album where he explicitly addresses this is called Freedom Suite, and that was recorded in 1958 in response to his attempt to rent an apartment and having a hard time doing that, even though he'd risen to a level of prominence as a musician. and had widespread recognition at that point, he still couldn't rent an apartment. He still couldn't hail a cab. So he put out this album, which was the first explicit statement on the civil rights struggle of the hard bop era. And on that album, he also wrote the liner notes, and he spent a long time getting the wording just right. And in that statement, which is so beautifully composed, essentially what he says is the black artist has exemplified the humanities. Black artists have exemplified the humanities in their very existence, and yet they're rewarded with inhumanity. And when I talked to Sonny about a month ago, he was still speaking on this theme. And he said that W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the co-founders of the NAACP, was the editor of The Crisis, wrote The Souls of Black Folk, and I mean, we could talk about Du Bois all day, was Sonny's neighbor growing up. And he used to see Du Bois on his way home from work, and they would be playing stickball, and they had the best wall at Du Bois's apartment, which was 409 Edgecombe, where much of the leadership of the NAACP lived. And Sonny recalled that Du Bois said that if any black artist rises to a level of prominence in the society, that they have a moral obligation to speak out against social injustice. And that he was always committed to that, and still committed to the black struggle. And that the way he sees it, that message that he put out there in the Freedom Suite, is still something that has not been heard. So, he's still fighting that fight, and it's still a part of what he's thinking about.
I was more so focused on the fraternal aspect of music. I get the political and social piece, but as a result of, I guess, desegregation, a lot of important figures like Du Bois, Sonny Rollins, moved out of the inner city, and it left a void. And now, those, I guess, who came after didn't have access because many of those cats moved out of the inner city, and so that's why the music, I guess, went into hip hop, because there was a void. So I wanted to know, did he talk about the fraternal, like being around musicians that impacted him, that lived around him, and did that have an impact on his musicianship and his music?
Absolutely. And I mean, not just Sonny, but many people have talked about the effect of jazz on 52nd Street as playing some role in diminishing the scene in Harlem on the original Swing Street. But yeah, in terms of that fraternal bond, that was there in Harlem for Sonny going all the way back. And he still talks about that. And his neighbors growing up still talk about that. What it was like to grow up on Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, where he was close with the drummer Arthur Taylor, and there's a trumpet player named Lowell Lewis that never made a name for himself, but they were kind of part of the music together. And then Lowell introduced Sonny to Thelonious Monk downtown, and then Sonny ended up joining Monk's band, and Sonny had this group when he was young in Sugar Hill, and he was the leader of the group. But Kenny Drew, the pianist, was a part of that. Jackie McLean, Arthur Phipps, so many, and we could just keep listing people, but they were all part of this scene. and they would do these cocktail sips, like these social dances in Harlem, and they had early gigs at St. Charles Church on like around 141st Street, and everything was there. They would be at the Apollo Theater all the time. That was kind of like Sonny's college in a way. And I mean, he was like really nervous, he said, when he first was a band leader at the Apollo, because he knew that folks in the neighborhood wouldn't let anything get past them. But yeah, and in terms of just like the bond with Coltrane too, you know, they were like musical brothers, but also spiritual brothers. They shared book suggestions with each other. Sonny recommended a book called Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and Coltrane recommended The Mysticism of Sound and Music by Hazrat Inayat Khan. And you know, eventually Sonny moved to the Lower East Side, and Sonny Stitt kind of helped get him an apartment. So, you know, that sense of community was always a part of it. And if we're talking like pre and post, I mean, it never really changed for him. And I found that in the interviews I did for this book. I mean, that he was always looking out for people, that he was always in touch with people in the community, and he still is. And I mean, there are young musicians that he's still looking out for. There's a young saxophone player named James Brandon Lewis, and you know, Sonny became aware of his music, and he's still looking out for him. So you know, there were Dee Bridgewater talked about this. I mean, it was always something that was present in his music. I don't know if that really gets at what you're asking, but I mean, yeah, there was always this sense of solidarity and a sense of community. But you're right. I mean, there was this element of a dispersal, kind of maybe posing challenges to keeping that going. So it wasn't as simple as like, oh, you know, onward and upward. I mean, there was. I think there was a sense of.
Yeah, they learn from each other.
Yeah.
That was the university back then. You mentioned jazz being important to, you know, institutions and that sort of thing. So that, I guess that's a difference in how people are getting access to jazz nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he learned from Art Blakey or Monk. If people wanted to know a tune, they would go to Monk's house, and Monk would have the changes. They would get it from him, not from the real book. Yeah.
Well, I have a question basically for the both of you. In the conversation that's been going on, we've talked about kind of like the cultural framework of jazz, and when you were talking about his love for, you know, American Songbook and all of that, I thought about the kind of conversation that he was trying to have through the music he selected that he wanted to interpret in various ways. And you don't get a lot of the kind of American scene jazz artists sitting down in conversations with, you know, Johnny Carson or Colbert in some ways. And so my question is, what do you feel your role is with this book and other biographers with kind of getting that cultural conversation about the importance and impact of jazz in these artists in terms of the American and global landscape of its prominence and what it's doing, and how can we help institutions like UDC continue to do the kind of things that it's doing to sort of get that message out, not only to its students, but maybe even to students in lower grades and all who need to get this kind of understanding because of the philosophy that it provides, and you were saying about in terms of your own children and all, having this kind of philosophy and framework as part of their cultural kind of understanding might help make them better citizens and able to have a better civic discourse than the one we saw on the State of the Union last night.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Do you want to? So, yeah, no, thanks for that question, because I've thought about Sonny's approach to the Great American Songbook and the way that he represents American culture in his music. And, you know, he was fortunate to have a family that prioritized in education in these cultural forms from a very young age. And they always listened to the radio, so they would hear, you know, the Apollo Theater, but also the Grand Ole Opry. And he was raised, he was steeped in all aspects of American culture from a very young age. And then later on, he became interested in Native American culture and music as well. So he started looking into that tradition, and even would try to incorporate some of that into his performances. And then he got a mohawk haircut in the early 60s, and people thought he was doing that just to be eccentric. This is kind of a theme with Sonny Rollins, was he was always doing things and people thought he's just a, you know, an oddball. But there was always some reason for it. Or another example is like he would carry weights in a briefcase. And people thought, oh, Sonny's so weird. But this was a part of his promoting physical fitness. So anyway, he got this mohawk haircut, and it was to honor the Mohicans. And it was almost like a kind of land acknowledgement that he was doing. You know, everybody's always doing that, but Sonny was kind of living that in a certain way. And he would sometimes perform in a cowboy hat, and he had, you know, he made Way Out West, the Western album. So I think people thought that it was a reference to that, but it was also kind of a commentary on American history. And he would take the cowboy hat off sometimes, and underneath it would be a mohawk. So just to remember, you know, the origins. You know, he has a song called Erigin, which is Nigeria spelled backwards, which was in honor of the Nigerian independence movement. But I think it's also kind of an idea of thinking back to the origin of things. But, you know, it's not, I mean, I think the question of how to get this in schools and how to promote it in every level of education is something that a lot of people have been thinking about, but I think that we need more of it. So I've been involved in that effort. I'm trying to do more. You know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we could get this as part of the curriculum, because I think that there are many lessons to be taught from this music and from the way that it represents our culture and the greatest possibilities of living in a melting pot as we do. I think that Sonny's music always celebrated that, as well as the importance of having a voice like Sonny's out there representing that tradition. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I've answered how we can get it incorporated into curricular development more. I'd definitely like to see that happen, and I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts.
But at least, you know, from what you're saying, and you know, you talk about people thinking, oh, he's just quirky. No, he's having a conversation. And
Absolutely.
it's people like yourself who interpret that and present that in ways that the artist may not be able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think he can talk about it as well, but you know, I think it's important that
I don't
the
think anyone
educators
asks
can also.
them. They just ask them to play.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. So if they did just ask him to play, he would find a way to get that message across through the music.
Antonio Parker's question prompted me to shift gears from what I was originally going to comment on. But I got the honor of presenting Sonny Rollins with the Jazz and Justice Award at a gala for WPFW back in 2007. And within a week, I got a letter, and this demonstrates his sensitivity also. Dear my man Rusty, good to see you the other night. Thanks for the introduction. The whole thing was sort of last minute for us, and I didn't know which hat I was expected to wear. My political activist hat or my jazz musician hat. My acceptance speech was therefore very brief and not responsive to either aspect of Sonny Rollins, I guess. Anyway, good to see you, and keep the music alive in DC. You know, it's really just incredible receiving that letter. Again, his speech was marvelous, you know, and very much on point.
Yeah, he always has been.
But before I was going to get into this, I was thinking of another time, and how jazz fans can get into like sports fans. You know, it's either LeBron James or Steph Curry. You know, it's Sonny Rollins or John Coltrane. Back in the 1970s, I was close friends with a broadcaster on WHUR, Ron Sutton, and Ron had a thing to disparage Miles Davis and really praise Clifford Brown. And we used to trade shows with each other. He'd come on my WAME show, I'd go on his HUR show, we do specials on Charlie Parker. He called me one time and said, look, Rollins is doing this workshop for the Howard students. We got a chance to interview him. Come on, join me. It was wonderful. But Ron asked a question that, you know, like lawyers know not to ask the question that you don't know the answer to. And he said, Sonny, who is it better for you to play with, Clifford Brown or Miles Davis? And Nuke said, you know, as much as I miss Brownie, it still hurts me to this day. I really miss him. For me, it was far more important to have played with Miles Davis. His impact on the music and changing the direction of it was far more important for me to be a part of that. And I thought that was very telling, you know. And Ron didn't get the answer he wanted, but it's something that resonates with me even through 45 years later.
Yeah, it's interesting that he gave it to Miles Davis. I mean, I think there's a tendency to always want to pick a favorite or declare a king.
Well, you know, Reuben will tell you about some serious jazz fans and how it's either praising one at the disparagement of the other a lot of times, which a lot of us kind of frown upon because it's all good. You know. It's like going back to Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins.
I think it's a good problem to have, and I was thinking too about Joanne's question, you know, well, I was brought up in a house with a lot of music, and, you know, I could hear it in a given, and I'm not gonna get nostalgic or anything, but it's like my father loved the Grand Ole Opry, and he loved Muddy Waters, and he loved Sonny Rollins. My mom loves Chopin. If I hear any Chopin nocturne, I'm gone, you know, and I just thought people, if you went to a record store, just be like A for, could be Louis Armstrong, you know, B Beethoven. I just thought everybody was like that. It is not the case, needless to say. And yeah, I wish I had an answer to your question. What the heck, at 66, I am owning the breadth of stuff I love. And I try and, you know, present a smidgen of it on the radio every couple of weeks. And I will, as R.T. Shep once said, he said, I pass through the insipid panorama of Americana with an enormous romanticism. It has never left me. So I'm owning that and also trying to remind people that, you know, there's a continuum. And because like my father and his friends would, and I'm speaking, you know, metaphorically here, like they put on a Martin of Vandellas record, and then they put on Chick Webb, and they point a gun to your head, and they say, pick one. and I would say, what if you loved them both? You know, and I think to love one does not diminish the love for the other. And so and I think again, back to this book and what Mr. Rollins has given us in terms of breadth and, well, again, Quincy, the soul and the science, and it's like, it's endless. It's so endless. And that's why I say, as a erstwhile programmer and lifelong music lover, it's such a good problem to have. It's like, if you think about music, it's given us Sonny Rollins and, Chopin and Buddy Holly and so many people. Man, it's like, remember the rappers used to say on and on to the break of dawn. It's beyond that. So I'm going out like that.
We just have one more.
First of all, thanks for writing the book. Really, I think it's going to be a great document to have about Sonny. So I have a question, and then I want to share a recollection. So my question is, given Mr. Rollins' lack of formal training, I wanted to know if he had any opinion about the pedagogy of jazz, that you can study it at university, you can get a degree at it, you can study it at a conservatory, and did he have any view or opinion about that?
I think it's a great question. Are you involved in jazz education in any way?
I'm a broadcaster and writer.
Okay. So let me preface this by saying I cannot speak for Sonny, but I do feel that the way that he came up in the music was so important to his development that I think he's always known that you can't learn everything through classes or textbooks or method books, or even just listening to records and doing transcriptions. Let's say that you really have to be a part of the community, and that so much of the tradition passes down orally. That's why I'm happy to see everybody here tonight. But I don't think that he's categorically opposed to jazz education at, in higher education, or being taught in the schools. I think that he's been actually very happy about that. And there was a long time, starting in the 70s, when most of his performances were in colleges, in part because they were paying, but also because he saw the value of continuing on in the tradition in that way. So I think that, we would have to ask him, but I think that he would feel that it's important to have it both ways, that it can't just only be one approach. That when it came in the 90s to the culture wars and the kind of jazz wars between uptown and downtown, or like jazz at Lincoln Center and the Knitting Factory or the downtown scene, that Sonny didn't pick sides. He didn't choose sides there. That he saw the importance of both. And that the mindset of there can only be one approach was never something that he subscribed to. But once again, it can't all be done in a classroom. And I think also he feels that, you can't cut off the roots. So that tradition does need to be passed down from practitioners. That's why I think that you're seeing more and more, people who have lived the music becoming a part of university education, working in high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. But once again, I don't think he would say that that's enough. But you know, it's also tough if there's no institutional backing for it, that you're then at the mercy of the market. And he had to deal with corrupt businessmen and promoters for his entire career. So I think that's one of the reasons why he did start to embrace the idea of performing in colleges.
So the recollection that I wanted to share is, I was at the event that Rusty referenced, the 30th anniversary of WPFW, and so I got a chance to meet him there, and I brought with me some albums that I hope that he might autograph. And I don't even remember how many I brought. It was maybe a dozen or more. And so what I remember and what I'll never forget is how graciously he autographed each and every one of them. And he even autographed them. He didn't just write his signature, because my name is Miles, and he wrote one and said, "My man Miles," and then another one, and you know, on our broadcast, he said, "Thanks for playing the music." I mean, he put something personal on each album, and I'll just never forget that.
That's beautiful. I want to thank you. This has just been wonderful, wonderful. I think, any other questions or? Okay. Thank you so much. This has really been a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Reuben Jackson.